Hey everyone, it's Junaid from Meninfluencer. Hope you look good, feel good and are ready to prosper, because in this video I want to talk about a very important topic, and that's how to deal with toxic parents. So when it comes to a lot of you individuals that watch these videos, a lot of you guys have asked me to make this video, and thus today is the time that I'm gonna make this video. I've got my essential shirt on and I'm ready to go for war. And thus, if you're excited, please stick with me till the end. And if you're someone that is new to this channel and would love to see more videos like this, please consider to the subscribe button, because this way I can provide you the best content when it comes to transforming yourself by being more cold, mysterious, and at the same time being able to deal with toxic people. So with that said, let's jump into the video. Number 1, mental isolation. So when it comes to dealing with toxic individuals, the best way to deal with them is to either get rid of them or try to minimize the contact with them. But unfortunately, when it comes to toxic parents, it is quite complicated and messy at the same time. And thus that's why it's very important to be able to mentally isolate yourself, because you can't always hide in your room to avoid all of the drama that perhaps happens in your household. And at the same time, you do not want to be someone that completely isolates themselves 24/7 and doesn't have any sort of social contact with other individuals. And that's why it's important to be able to mentally isolate yourself, because even if you're gonna have a conversation with your parents, you'll be able to control your emotions and mentally isolate a certain part of yourself to be able to deal with the toxicity. Although this is a good strategy that will help out a lot of individuals, you must also understand and consider whether your parents are actually toxic individuals, or that you simply have a toxic perspective because they don't allow you to do the things that you want in life. And I will talk a little bit more about this later in this video, because toxicity isn't always one way. Sometimes it's just a change of perspective that can help you out as well. But coming back to the mental isolation part, if you're someone that wants to deal with toxic parents, it is crucial to be able to mentally isolate yourself when it comes to certain areas or topics that you discuss with your parents, because this way you'll be able to filter out the toxicity, all of the nasty emotions, and be able to keep yourself strong. But I also understand that it can be quite tough to mentally isolate yourself sometimes, even though you're trying to, because our emotions can get in our way. Some topics are just simply hard to talk about, and thus it will automatically always be toxic. And in that instance, you want to get rid of all of the mental stress that you're occurring on yourself by having some sort of mental outlet. For some individuals, it's just simply watching some entertainment on YouTube. For others, it's to go and hit the gym, something that I would recommend for a lot of individuals, or any other sort of activity that will give you some sort of mental outlet. And please don't be someone that's constantly staying in your room and is isolating themselves from the rest of the world, because at the end of the day, this is extremely unhealthy for you and it won't help you to prosper in life, because you're simply just avoiding your problems rather than dealing with them. And I'm not telling you to have some sort of direct confrontation, but what I am saying is that if you're gonna have a mental outlet when it comes to your problems, every time you're gonna have that outlet, you'll end up constantly improving your mental toughness, and thus the next time this will happen to you, you'll be able to control your emotions a lot better and deal with all of the toxicity. Number 2, pride and ego. So when it comes to a lot of parents, not even toxic parents, unfortunately, they've got quite a lot of pride and ego attached to their kids. And the way this works is that they've invested so much time and effort into their kids. Obviously, they love their kids, and thus they want you to succeed and have their own self-worth attached to your success. And hey, I'm not telling you that you need to succeed for your parents, because who am I to tell you that? But I'm just explaining this to you so you better understand where your parents are coming from, because this pride comes from a good perspective. Because if you're gonna succeed, they feel like that they've succeeded when it comes to their parenting. However, you and I know that everyone has their own expectations and everyone can decide what they want to do themselves, and thus in this instance this makes this situation a little bit more complicated, because now ego is introduced, because perhaps you don't feel like that they need to relate your success to their pride, but at the same time the reality is that a lot of parents do. So what's the solution for this? And when it comes to that question, there can be quite a lot of different answers, but it's quite contextual, because you can't simply give one answer to that question. But I can give you a few key takeaways that will help you in your situation, because when it comes to answering that question, you can ask yourself several more little questions to be able to understand yourself a little bit better. And then after that, you can try to understand your parents, and this way you'll be able to understand the difference in perspective and see whether you can find some sort of similarities when it comes to both your pride and egos. And this way, if you can find a bridge, that's amazing. But in the instance that you can't, run far away. I'm just joking. So in the instance that you can't find similarities, try to accept and understand their perspective, because I'm going to talk a little bit more about their perspective in the upcoming point. So hopefully you'll be able to understand where they are coming from. But basically, it's very important to understand where they are coming from, because even though you don't particularly agree with them, even though it doesn't feel like it makes sense to you, at least you now understand where they're coming from. And thus, if there is pride and ego involved, now you understand how to deal with this. Number 3, lifestyle difference. So when it comes to a lot of individuals and their parents, most likely you're currently living a very different lifestyle, because most likely your parents are out there working, taking care of the kids or whatever it is in their world, while you're out here being on social media, something that not all parents understand. You're going to school, perhaps you have a part-time job, and with the current situation, the pandemic, it can be quite difficult for you. And hey, I'm not saying that it can't be difficult for your parents, because clearly everyone has their own struggles. But when it comes to the pandemic, there's a lot of evidence that's showing that it has a bigger impact on younger individuals. And thus, this might be one of the reasons that you feel like that you're dealing with toxic parents. Because let's be honest, taking the pandemic into consideration, when it comes to your parents, most likely when they were younger, they've already had their fun, they've already done a lot of things that they wanted to do, and most likely that's the reason why they settled down and produced you. But when it comes to you, you're probably a young adult or a teenager, and you feel like that you've lost most of your prime years. You're still young and you want to explore so many things. There's so many opportunities out there, but unfortunately at the moment you can't do that. And then if you look on social media, you see other people living amazing lives, while you're out here in your own house, in your own room, feeling like you're not doing the things you want to do. And on top of that, you've got parents that are already telling you that you're so lucky that you can just stay at home, that you're so lucky that you've already got an iPhone, that you're so lucky that you're living a better life than them, and that you have no worries. And then you're out there saying, thank you mom and dad, I didn't know I needed more toxic energy in my life. And the reason that I'm smiling is because we're smiling our pain away, right? I mean, who can relate to that? Because most likely a lot of us have felt this before in the past, or had instances where our parents introduced this to us. But does that necessarily mean that our parents are toxic? It doesn't always have to be. Because hey, now you understand that there's a lifestyle difference. And this brings me to number 4, generation difference. You know, in the last few decades, a lot of things have changed. Not only technology, but also the way we communicate, our social norms, our cultural norms, our behavior, and the list goes on and on. And this is the reason why there can be a generation difference. Because look, your parents have been brought up in a different generation, with a different perspective, different resources, and then you've got yourself over here. You've been brought up in this new era where there's more mental issues than in the past. We hear this all the time, that parents say that in the past they always had to struggle quite a lot. They had to work hard for what they've gained, while individuals out here don't particularly have to work as hard to get the same things. And although if you look at this, in the first world country, labor has decreased because most of it has been outsourced to third world countries. However, this doesn't mean that work has decreased, because a lot of jobs and a lot of social things we engage with are mentally. So if your parents engage with you, sometimes they clearly can't understand your perspective, because they have been brought up in a different generation with different resources in a different way, while you're out there being brought up in this generation with newer resources, newer technology, and a different way of communicating with people. Because let's be honest, social media does have a huge impact on a lot of us lives. And thus, if you're someone that is dealing with parents that don't fully understand this concept, they feel like you're just wasting your time. They don't understand why you're spending so much time on your phone, why you could be out here being productive in the traditional way. And this is where the difference is between both of you. And thus, if you're someone that wants to be able to deal with your parents, you need to understand the difference between those two worlds to be able to deal with your parents. Because a lot of times, especially if you're a teenager, you feel like that your parents are quite toxic, but they want the best for you, but they simply don't understand you in the same way that you understand yourself. And thus, even though it feels like that your parents are very toxic towards you, even though it feels like that they don't understand you in the way that you want them to understand you, it doesn't mean that they don't care about you. They're trying their best, but they simply live a different lifestyle. They are from a different generation, and thus you need to understand that it can be quite complex for them to understand you, and thus if you're gonna have arguments with them, if you're gonna have some sort of discussion with them, you need to understand that even though sometimes it can feel toxic, in a lot of instances it comes from a good place. So far in this video we've covered how you can mentally isolate yourself, understand their perspective, where they're coming from when it comes to their ego and pride, and by introducing your own perspective you can get this full picture to understand where each party is coming from. But now I want to move on to the next part of this video, and that is the actual toxic part. So number 5, ridiculous expectations. So sometimes parents feel like that they own you because they've created you, and thus they end up creating these ridiculous expectations that they want to get out of you, and this ends up creating a toxic environment for you. And there is a difference between wanting the best for you and having ridiculous expectations, because the truth is, at the end of the day, you can only make your own choices. Although other individuals can have an influence on your choices, at the end of the day, it's you who decides what you want. And the best way to deal with these ridiculous expectations is to simply ignore them in a lot of instances. If you feel like, in the instance that you don't have the same vision as them, in the instance that you don't have the same goals as them, because in those instances their goals and visions aren't in line with your goals and visions, and thus there's no point in trying to please your parents just for the sake of pleasing them if you end up living an unhappy and unfulfilled life. But I strictly do want to be clear about this, because you need to understand their perspective. Does it make sense what they're saying? Is it that the things that they're saying to you because they want the best for you, or is it because they've got ridiculous expectations? And to be able to find a difference between those two things is very hard, because you need to put your own personal bias to the side and need to look at it from a neutral perspective. So if you are a teenager or a young adult, try to understand that most likely you are very stubborn, especially to the things that your parents want from you. So please try to understand that there's some level of stubbornness in you to be able to understand your parents a little bit better. And once you figure this out and see that your parents are actually toxic, in that instance, perhaps it's better to make your own choices and go for a path that you feel like will be more fulfilling and make you feel happier. But at the same time, also be cautious that you're not only aiming for short-term goals, but also long-term goals. Because at the end of the day, a lot of teenagers and young adults feel like that they're still young and that they've got plenty of time, which is true. But eventually there will be a point that you won't be this young anymore, and thus it's also very important to look for the long run. It is also very important to understand your parents' perspective, because most likely if they want the best for you, they are aiming for the long term. Number 6, express their emotions. So what do I mean by express their emotions? Well, when it comes to your parents, in a lot of instances, if your parents are actual toxic parents, they end up expressing their emotions and portraying all of the negative energy on you. Because a lot of parents have also been through quite a lot, whether that's through their teenage years, currently they are going through some mental stress at work, or any other sort of mental distress. Unfortunately, when it comes to individuals, not only particularly toxic parents, but generally speaking pretty much everyone, a lot of us don't have the self-reflection or understand the fundamental importance when it comes to controlling our emotions, and thus these toxic parents end up portraying all of the emotions on their kids. So for example, if you end up going to your parents and tell them that you're thinking of starting a business, most likely if your parents are individuals that never started a business or have a perspective that starting a business is very hard and could be very dangerous, in that instance your parents will end up portraying those emotions on you. While if you've got parents that have started a successful business before, whether they've got it now or had in the past, they clearly realize that it is a possibility because they've seen that before. And thus, if you're gonna go to your parents with your idea, most likely they'll be more open to this suggestion and perhaps even help you out or encourage you, because they don't have these fearful or negative emotions attached to this idea. Because from their perspective and experience, business was a good idea. They've got very good emotions attached to it, and thus they will portray those good feelings, those good emotions on you. Well, when it comes to a parent that doesn't know a lot about business, or has the stigma that business can be very dangerous, it's very hard to succeed, in that instance, those parents are more likely to portray those fearful and negative energy on you. And I know this is a very long rant, but if you're someone that's interested in a topic like this, it's very important to know this, because this is the fundamental basis that you can build upon. And if you've got parents that are very negative, are very toxic. In most instances, it doesn't really help you to go forward in life. And the best way to deal with this is to be honest with yourself. So, are your parents in a position where you'd like to be? Whether that's financially, socially, spiritually, or even when it comes to their health. If the answer is no, with all due respect, even though you love your parents, you sometimes need to accept that they aren't the best guidance in that particular area. It's better to look for an outside source, because if your parents were qualified to help in that particular perspective, they would have reached those goals themselves. But in the instant that they haven't, they clearly aren't as qualified when it comes to that. Number 7, you can't change them. So when it comes to toxic people, and not even speaking about parents, sometimes people feel like that they need to change the toxic person in their life. But the thing about changing a toxic person is that, because first of all, they need to understand that they're toxic, because there's a lot of bounded rationality involved when it comes to this topic. And let me explain, because if an individual doesn't know that they're toxic, obviously they feel like that they're behaving normally, and thus if you tell them that they're toxic, they'll be like, where are you coming from? I'm not toxic. Or they end up either ignoring you or show more toxic behavior. And also when it comes to toxic individuals, a lot of times it already goes wrong at the first point, and that's that they need to be open to be changed. Because if an individual isn't open to see some sort of transformation, if an individual already feels like that they're good enough, they're smart enough, and they feel like that they're on top of the world, and they don't feel like that they need your feedback, obviously you can't change them. And that's pretty much with every toxic person. It doesn't even necessarily always have to be toxic parents. But the thing that makes it even more difficult when it comes to toxic parents is that not only are parents quite stubborn when it comes to this idea, because they've got some sort of pride and ego and don't feel like that their kids need to tell them how they need to behave, even though in some instances their kids know it better than them. They're also older than you, and thus if you want to shift someone's mentality, want to be able to change some habits, the longer that they're ingrained in your brain, the harder it gets. And thus, if someone is young and fresh, it's easier to kind of manipulate their brain. It's easier to change habits, change yourself, while the older you get, the longer you've got those habits, and thus it becomes very difficult to change yourself. Even if you are open to change yourself, the older you are, the longer you've got those habits, the harder it gets to change those habits. And sometimes, even though as hard as it can be, it's better to accept that you can't change them. Because even though if there is a small probability that you can, in most instances you end up putting so much effort, so much energy into this task that you end up draining yourself, and the risk to reward ratio is simply too high. So I know you enjoyed this video and you actually loved it, because I know you were dealing with some stuff and now you feel like you're able to deal better with your parents because you clearly understand their perspective a little bit better. You understand yourself a little bit better, and thus you're ready to create that healthy relationship with your parents that you were looking for. And hey, if this video did help you in any way, please let me know in the comments down below and leave a thumbs up for the YouTube algorithm, because I truly appreciate the support I get for these videos. And at the same time, it's always nice to know that these videos are actually life-changing for you. And also, if you're one of those individuals that feels like that this is the video that you were looking for, I hope it genuinely helps you out. So thank you so much for watching. I genuinely appreciate your time and I hope to see you on my next video. Bye bye.